Welcome, everyone, to a new dual franchise under the concept of Moneyball Reimagined between the Tampa Bay Rays and the New York Mets. A little bit of background about how this is all going to work and what the idea behind this new enterprise is. The concept is basically that the New York Mets and the Tampa Bay Rays have both been sold to a single ownership group named What Delay Industries. And this ownership group is inclined to take the Rays, who have always been a team that, even though they've had a lot of success in the last 15 years, has never spent a whole lot of money on their payroll and has always been kind of looking to cut costs, who plays in an outdated dump of a stadium that pretty much everyone agrees needs to go. Take that team and pump a ton of money into them, maybe the most money that has ever been pumped into a Major League Baseball team, and then see what happens. And conversely, take the New York Mets, who have always been a big market team and as of late have become incredibly willing to spend to the point that they entered the 2023 season in real life with the highest payroll in the history of Major League Baseball. Take that team and say, you know what? You guys keep seeming to spare no expense, and yet it doesn't lead to anything. Why don't we turn you into the Rays and start pinching pennies with you and see if you can kind of pull off an underdog story of sorts. So that's the idea. To that end, I'm going to be controlling both franchises, controlling not just the lineups and pitching rotation and actually playing the games, but controlling all of their transactions and, looking to re-sign players and trading players away and all those kinds of things. But with this idea in mind, there's obviously a lot of moving and shaking that needs to be done on both rosters in terms of we're going to have to trade a whole lot of guys in each instance, because if we want to turn the Rays into heavy spenders and if we want to turn the Mets into cheapskates, tons of contracts got to go from both teams. So that's the idea. If you're interested in this premise, I've linked in the description an article that I wrote that's just kind of providing more background and fleshing out more of the details of this scenario. But I do want to go through before I start the franchise and kind of, overview all of the different trades and roster moves that I'm going to make. I do want to go through just real quick the sliders and some of the basic settings, and then also review the house rules that I'm going to have for myself as I build out this scenario. So slider-wise, I am going to be using a slightly modified version of Mike Lowe's sliders. Mike Lowe is a user on operationsports.com who's been making sliders for a number of years. I'll link those sliders in the description as well. And in general, nothing too crazy to report. I do want to say that the stamina for starters is going to be a little bit higher because I'm going to be using quick counts. That's when every at bat starts with a pre-generated count of maybe it's 1-1 or 2-1 or 2-0, whatever. But that just helps the games go along quicker. But it also means that pitchers are always going to throw a lot more pitches. So that's going to be a little higher. And then everything else just kind of is what it is. The other thing I wanted to call out, pickoffs are going to be very low because in Major League Baseball in 2023, pitchers are limited in the amount of pickoffs that they can attempt. And so the CPU will still attempt pickoffs with this set at 0, so it's not like they never will. But between that pickoff rule and then also the bigger bases and the encouragement essentially that Major League Baseball has been going through to try and make stolen bases more of a thing again, I wanted to, as much as it's possible in a virtual world, try and replicate that. So that's why base runner steal ability and frequency are both tuned up a little bit. It's still really hard to steal bases against the computer in this game. So hopefully both for my sake, but also the computer's sake, we're able to take advantage of the new landscape in 2023 and steal more bases. But otherwise, everything else is pretty straightforward. Settings, we have legend, and then everything else is just kind of, personal preference. So if you have any questions as the games get rolling about any of the different settings that I'm using, feel free to let me know. But I won't belabor anything there. Just want to show I'll be playing on legend. And then as I dive in to the franchise, I will be using the rosters of Cycloniac on Operation Sports. It's called the True Sim roster set. Cycloniac and a lot of different users on Operation Sports put a ton of work into building just a roster set that had ratings that not only were fitting but also changing equipment and building out the minor leagues in a really realistic way. So fantastic work by them. In this situation, I'm going to take the approach that the Rays need to become essentially the richest team ever, and the Mets need to become not the cheapest or the poorest team ever, but they have to have the smallest payroll in the league. So what that means is the Mets have to have a payroll less than that of the Oakland A's, who are the next kind of like lowest team that one could possibly strive to be under. Their starting payroll is going to be $48 million, and I'll show that on screen right now. So with that being the case, the Mets have to be under $48 million after all of the moves have been made. And for however long this dual franchise lasts, they can never go above a payroll of $50 million. So $50 million is their ceiling. They can never spend more than that as a player payroll. I should clarify, when I say payroll, I'm talking about the player payroll, not talking about coaches' salaries or advertising or any of the other things that you can do. So player payroll has to always be below $50 million throughout the duration of this franchise, and for this season cannot be above $48 million, which is what the A's are at. The Rays, on the other hand, they have to be above $300 million for the duration of this franchise, and for this season, the Mets actually start with the highest payroll, which, is kind of the impetus for this whole thing. Their payroll starts at $295.6 million, and I'll show that right here. So that means the Rays have to be above that for this year, and for the duration of the franchise, be above $300 million. Now, in order to accomplish this, I have to do a couple of things that normally I wouldn't do. I have to turn on ignore budgets, because I could do this with budget still being on for the Mets, but the Rays, there would be no way for me to tell the game, hey, the Rays are under new ownership and they're just basically setting money on fire, spare no expense. There's no way to do that without ignoring the budgets. So I do have to turn ignore budgets on, but otherwise all the other settings will be kind of as they would normally be. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to control all of the various, both day-to-day and kind of long-term general manager scouting, all those different kinds of things for both teams. So that's how that's going to work. With that being said, a couple house rules I want to go through. For each team, I have to keep a decent amount of the original players, because I don't want to turn this into like a fantasy draft where the entire roster has completely flipped. So for the Rays, I need to keep 13 of the original 26. So if we look at the roster, now the only kind of caveat I'll allow myself in this instance is, let's say that someone is in like single A or double A, whatever. I can keep them, and that counts as keeping an original player because they are an original member of the Tampa Bay Rays organization. So any of these guys who are in the minor leagues, I am allowed to keep them as part of my keeping at least 13 out of 26. But for the Rays, I got to keep 13 out of 26. And for the Mets, I got to keep 8 out of 26. So that's the first caveat. With the Mets, the reason why it's lower is because if we look at the Mets budget, which there's that $295.6 million player payroll again. If we look at the salaries, though, it would be really hard to field a team that was even mildly competitive if I was keeping half of these guys on the roster, let alone, I don't know mathematically if I'd even be able to actually get under that 48.0 requirement that I need to get under. So that's why I'm keeping it a little lesser for the Mets. Still keeping 8 players around to try and have some continuity. I'm going to try and keep Pete Alonso. So we have kind of like a younger, I mean, he's already 28, but a star that's been there a little while and maybe can stay with the team moving forward, potentially. Who knows about his price point. But that's going to be the stipulation there with the Mets. So got to keep 8 Mets or more. Got to keep 13 Rays or more. And then beyond year 1, whatever happens, happens. So that's one house rule. The other house rule, the teams cannot trade with each other because that would just make things way too easy. I would be able to solve each team's problem in the same breadth. So we're not doing that. Teams can't trade with each other, but I can trade with everyone else. And then to that end, the trades I make, obviously it's going to be unrealistic in the sense of I'm making tons and tons of trades for 2 franchises that are now run by the same owner. Clearly, we have already suspended our disbelief to engage in this scenario, but I'm not going to make trades that would be unbelievably laughable. I'm going to try and get good players, but the computer is easy to take advantage of in this game with trades, and I'm not going to try and make trades that are just so over the top in my favor, and I'm going to do that in 2 different ways. The first way is with the Rays. So if I am making a trade, if you look at the bar where it says we're definitely interested in making this deal, and then there's an interest bar above that. If I am making a trade with the Rays, the interest bar for the computer needs to be more than the minimum amount that they would take a trade. So this trade would be acceptable. Now, this trade right here would not be acceptable because even though it says we're definitely interested in making the deal and the computer would still accept this trade, you can't see any color on that bar there. It's basically the minimum amount of interest that they would have to say yes. So I'm not going to do that in this instance. I'm not going to make trades like that for the Rays. That means that the CPU has to be more than the minimum interested for me to make a trade with the Rays. The idea behind that is just it's going to be easier to make trades with a team where you aren't worried about the budget at all. The Mets aren't going to have that stipulation because it's going to be a little harder to build out a competitive roster with the Mets, given that I'm going to be looking for players who are on smaller salaries, and generally those players are going to be younger and they're going to be more valuable in the eyes of their original teams. So that's one stipulation I just wanted to call out as well with regard to trades. And with that, I think it's time that we dive in and start building out these rosters and then looking through them and seeing what both teams are going to be looking like.
Now that the trades have been completed, let's see what our overview is of everything. So we see we have a player salary payroll of $322 million. Going down the line, plenty of big contracts, but part and parcel to that, a lot of guys over 30. I'm sure if we could calculate the average age of rosters, that the Rays very quickly went from one of the youngest to steamrolling towards AARP and retirement. So with that being the case, I'll just take you down through the entirety of the roster. Most of the minor leagues stayed pretty static. I had to trade a good deal of prospects to pick up all the guys that you see up here, but by and large, not a whole lot of extracurriculars happening with the minor leagues. If we look at the lineups, certainly a lot of different ways that this could have gone, but I tried to favor higher contact and higher vision earlier in the lineup, and then try not to get too righty or lefty heavy. Lefty heavy would be really hard with only 2 lefties on the roster as it is, but a lot of tough calls here. This is certainly subject to change, but this is what we're doing against righties and against lefties. We don't have to look at the no DH lineups because there will always be a DH, but that's what the lineup looks like. You might notice Harold Ramirez in here. If you see his contact against righties is pretty good too, so that can be useful in a pinch hit spot. But the contact against lefties, 93, best on the team, pretty much by far, with the exception of Wander Franco. So that's what we're looking like against righties and against lefties. And I do want to also mention one of the house rules of this undertaking is that in the case of the Rays, I needed to keep at least 13 of the original Rays, whether they were in AAA or the major leagues to start. They had to be original Tampa Bay Rays starting the roster. Had to keep them on my 26-man major league roster. And so you'll see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then none on the bench. So 6 Rays for the position players who are original Rays. And then if we head over to the rotation, we have DeGrom, Glasnow, Castillo, Stroman, Eflin. That's all pretty straightforward. Bullpen, I have 2 long relief guys, 1 lefty, 1 righty. Both of them could easily be starters or staminas or 75. So I like that kind of combo there. And then the bullpen just kind of is what it is. Certainly could be a potential upgrade spot at the trade deadline or as we get closer to the postseason. We'll see how it fares through the initial couple months and see what kind of injuries we pick up. But on this side of the coin, Glasnow is an original Ray, Eflin is an original Ray, Springs, Chirinos, Clevenger, Fairbanks, Adam, Poche. So that puts us at 14 total Rays out of the 26 on my roster. So while we're bringing in a lot of new faces, we're also keeping a lot of the OGs around, as it were. So that's what the roster is looking like. And with that, we will head over to the Mets side of things. All right, so here we have the Mets. If we take a look at the budget, the number we had to be under was 48.0, and we are currently at 43.8. If we scroll through here, we can see Pete taking up a good chunk. What would that be? About a quarter of our salary just by himself. And as we can see, he is heading into arbitration next year. So depending on what kind of season he has, that'll be a situation that we'll have to monitor and potentially act on. But in the meantime, he's here. And then as you can see, with a couple exceptions, we're pretty much filling out the roster with 720 and below. The exceptions, Tommy Edman, we picked him up from St. Louis. He's very versatile, can play infield and outfield, everywhere but first and catcher. And then also a big thing with him, switch hitter and a really good fielder. So that's a nice combo to have. So we'll have him, even though his primary is center field, we'll have him playing second base. And then another non-minimum guy, Evan Longoria. Just a nice cagey veteran to have around. I like that his secondary is first base because with 3 catchers on the roster, none of whom can play any other position, it's good to be able to have someone who can spell Pete when we need to. So good veteran presence, rakes against lefties. Beyond that, if we go down, we have Harold Castro, who's going to be a bench presence. As you can see, he is truly the jack of all trades. Good contact as well. So it's good to have him around. And Vogelbach, I don't intend to keep. He was automatically on waivers when the franchise started. That was not something that I chose to do. So depending on what happens with his waiver process, we will either trade him or I guess keep him maybe in AAA or something. He's currently on the Major League roster because we have to wait to see what happens with his waiver wire situation. So we'll see about that, but I don't plan to keep him. And then beyond that, we had to deal a lot of our better prospects. Not that the Mets had a ton to begin with, but most of the guys who were B overall potential have been shipped out. I think the only A prospect that we had to begin with was Alvarez, and he's going to be starting, hitting, and cleanup pretty much from day one. So that's the kind of zoomed out view. If we look more at the lineup and pitching rotation, this is what we're going with against righties. Just like with the Rays, it's a very righty-heavy lineup. We do have a couple switch hitters in there and some lefties off the bench, but I wanted to get another lefty bat in against righties, so that's why Brett Beatty is going to be starting against righties, even though he's a little bit lower rated than someone like, for example, Chas McCormick. And then if we look at the lefty against DH, in both lineup instances, there were a lot of tough calls to make and a lot of kind of wishy-washy, could go either way. It's not often you see someone who doesn't even play against righties in the starting lineup, at least, leading off against lefties. But Chas McCormick has an 89 contact. And then I wanted to try and balance it out a little bit. So I had Taveras up here second. Against lefties, we are going to be pretty much all righties. But we do have some lefty bats in Beatty and Castro who can come in the event that a reliever comes in who's going to throw lefty. So, or going to throw righty, excuse me. So that's what we're looking like with our lineup. Pitching rotation, our ace is going to be Justin Steele, which normally is not something you say if you have any hopes of postseason contention. And that's not meant to slight Mr. Steele, but his overall is clearly not at the upper echelon of what a lot of aces are going to be. We'll see. I mean, his contract is really nice, but that's about it. So we were able to get him for a pretty good value at a rate that most other starters we were not going to be able to get. So we're rocking with him. And then we got a couple young guys in Bryce Miller David Peterson is not necessarily that young in terms of his age, but his service is still within the minimum range. Tommy Henry, who we got from Arizona, he's a younger guy. And then Tyler McGill. So we'll see. I will say, though, with regard to our pitching staff, I am happy with how the back end of the bullpen came together. Felix Bautista is an outstanding closer to have in the back end. And Alex Lang, who we got from Detroit, he shows a lot of promise as well. So we will see. We do have Jeff Cantillo in the bullpen as kind of a sixth starter, a long reliever, in case of injury, spot starter. So that's what we're looking like there. I did want to go through the continuity piece of the roster, and by that I mean I set rules for myself in doing this and how many of the original players I had to keep on the roster even while making all these trades. So with the Rays, it was I had to keep 13 out of the original 26, and if someone was in the minors, that's fine too, that counts. So I had to keep 13 of 26 original Rays, and for the Mets, I had to keep 8 out of 26. And so if we look, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So 9 of the original Mets hanging around. I did mention earlier we have 3 catchers, none of whom can play any other position. Will Smith, Francisco Alvarez, and Kevin Pareda. We'll see how that goes. That might be something that we have to pivot away from, particularly if injuries crop up at that position or another. So we'll give it a go with the DH. It makes it a little easier because I'll plan to have Francisco or Will DHing, kind of alternating that, and then filling in as needed when guys need a break. But that's what the Mets are looking like.